I was born with a birth defect called spina bifida.
I am a congenital amputee.
I have autism.
I use a wheelchair.
I'm legally blind.
I have a traumatic brain injury.
I'm dyslexic.
I have a couple of disabilities.
I have autism.
I'm a little person.
I'm an upper extremity double amputee, which is politically correct for, look, Ma, no hands.
Disability comes in so many shapes and so many different nationalities and backgrounds and demographics.
A lot of people, or a fair amount of people that have various disabilities that in school it was a challenge for them.
I saw in my classrooms children, students with hidden disabilities.
Only 65% of youth with disabilities graduate high school.
A lot of educators, they let them just, coast.
And as a parent who are educators, I think it's important to challenge children and have those high expectations. Sometimes children aren't meeting their expectations, and sometimes you just have to raise them.
It's really important that people with disabilities don't fall off the cliff.
I'm going to college. I'm smart and capable of doing the work.
We look at immigration status, we look at gender expression, but disability is always left out of the conversation.
The disability is also like being a minority, like being Asian American. It's another battle that I have to face.
People with disabilities are problem solvers.
My autism allows me to build Legos faster than people that usually could.
I'm a scuba diving instructor.
I am a rolling empire.
Dress management.
I finish my work on time.
I have more than autism.
It's something that will impact communities and individuals regardless of race, regardless of income.
I have been in and out of a wheelchair. There's nothing worse than coming in to a room for a job that could change your life and having people go,
People are just uncomfortable with what is not considered the norm. When you look at the issues of addiction or homelessness or criminal justice reform, there's generally a disability angle to the conversation.
Sometimes, if the police don't know that you're deaf, they'll handcuff you, and then you can't sign.
Black people with disabilities are being also harassed or killed or put in jail.
There's a difference within philanthropies in terms of their mission. Some are focused on education, some are focused on labor, some are focused on racial disparity. Disability is always left out. Disability needs to be front and center.
Respect.
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 Respectability.
Respectability.
Ability.
RespectAbility.
RespectAbility.
So now I want to hand the microphone over to Victoria Grace, who is one of our fellows in our National Leadership Program.
Hi everyone, as Lauren just said, my name is Victoria Grace Asokamsiakam, and I am a fellow in RespectAbility's National Leadership Program. And today I'll be introducing our moderator for our Intersectionality panel, Dr. Donna R. Walton, the founder and president of Divas with Disabilities. So before she got her doctorate, Donna R. Walton was confident and hopeful with dreams of international stardom. But at 18 years old, all it took was one diagnosis to turn her life upside down. A dangerous form of bone cancer, osteogenic sarcoma, threatened Walton's life and forced the amputation of her left leg above the knee. After the crisis that took her leg, Walton became motivated to fight for the respect and dignity she believes all people deserve, especially African American women with disabilities. In 1996, Walton created her small business, LEGG Talk, to help individuals translate their personal visions into action and sustain change. In 2012, she founded the Divas with Disabilities Project, a digital campaign aimed to support women of color with disabilities. The bulk of Walton's work highlights diversity, and disability awareness. Walton herself has spoken with numerous groups such as African American Women on Tour Conference and the U.S. Army. But perhaps Walton is best known for her facilitation of empowerment saloons for young girls and women of color. In these spaces, young women learn to embrace their inner strength and gain self-confidence as well as self-control over life's challenges. Of her success, Walton has written, "To arrive where I am, I had to break down all the meanings my life had for me as a two-legged person and reconstruct a life for myself as an amputee, one that is empowered with courage and determination." And in her book, Shattered Dreams, Broken Pieces, Walton shares her experiences over the course of several decades as she learned to rebuild her world, regain her confidence, and achieve unforeseen success. And you can find this on Amazon. So please join me in welcoming our moderator, Dr. Donna R. Walton.
Thank you. All right, 2 words. Leg talk. Okay. I want to say, first of all, that I am so proud to be able to follow Ms. Emery. That was just a phenomenal speech that she gave. Her remarks were really resonating in my life. So I'm going to start off this panel with setting the tone for the topic that we have on intersectionality. And it comes from my book, which is found online and bookstores everywhere. Do not try to constrain me. Never try to fit me in a box of your own making, because I am more, so much more than you can imagine, so much more that you can force to fit a tiny space limited by your lack of vision. That poem in my new book, I thought I would share with you because it sets the tone for intersectionality. You see, when I lost my leg 42 years ago, society tried to compartmentalize me. They tried to see me only as a woman. Then they tried to see me only as a person of color, a black woman. And then they wanted to see only my disability. But when you lose a part of yourself, you do not lose your whole self. You cannot be compartmentalized. I am more than just one leg. I am a woman, and I am a woman with a disability. Standing forthright, in power, unapologetically. So when I show up authentically. In that space, consistently. What I want to share with you is that it is very difficult to walk into a room and that the first thing a person sees is my cane. They see my limp, and everything else gets erased. My whole idea about who I am is always challenged. My identities are always fragmented and marginalized. Kimberly Crenshaw actually brought the term intersectionality into the forefront 28 years ago when she coined the term intersectionality. In her paper, she says it's a way to help explain the oppression of African American women. Now today this term is used, right, in all national conversations about racial justice, identity politics, policing, and disability studies. And she confirmed, and she definitely confirmed for me, that those who live at the intersection of various identity categories in our society often get marginalized. Today's panel is going to explore the importance of intersectionality, enabling people of color and immigrants and disabilities to succeed in life. I have a distinguished panel that I'm going to allow to introduce themselves. I think people should always be able to speak for themselves. So I'm going to start with Katie Heigen on my left to introduce yourself, and then I'll move with Stephanie Farhan, and then I'll move with Clarence Page.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? My name is Katie Hagan. I'm a Respectability Fellow here on the Communications Department. I'm a native of Minnesota, although I was adopted from Vietnam. I also identify as queer, so on the LGBT identity spectrum. I am also deaf, hard of hearing. I have 2 cochlear implants that help me hear. And, well, I'm a woman, so that's pretty self-explanatory. I am at Respectability just for the summer, and I'm happy to be working with other people with disabilities, and I'm happy to be on this panel with so many great other people here too.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Hi, everyone can hear me all right? Yes, good. So my name is Stephanie Farfan. I am originally from Sunrise, Florida, and then I moved here for grad school. I am currently an intern at Win Without War. It's a progressive nonprofit in the foreign policy sphere. So that's where I come from. I'm also a little person and a Latina woman. So I have these various identities that sort of make me who I am.
You're also a good writer, by the way.
Oh, thank you, Stan. I'm also a good writer, so.
Clarence?
I'm Clarence Page, and I am a writer as well. And I am currently a nationally syndicated columnist for the Chicago Tribune and other newspapers around the country. And being a tireless self-promoter, I appear on a number of TV programs and radio programs, because this is Washington after all, where there are more microphones than people to sit in front of them. But I'm very happy to be in front of this microphone today.
Microphone's not on, so. Oh.
It'd be nice if the microphone's turned on. Let's see.
Testing.
Now you have to start all over.
Yeah, that's okay. These are the things I do to get applause. But anyway, as I was saying, I'm Clarence Page. I'm a nationally syndicated columnist for the Chicago Tribune, and I'm very happy to be here today. When it comes to identity, I've been through a number of them, and it's always been changed for me. I mean, when I was a kid, I was colored or Negro. And then by the time I got to college, we became black. And then by the time I became established in Chicago as a journalist, we became African American. That was around late 80s, some of you will recall with me. And nowadays I'm just as often categorized as a person of color. So I feel as though I've made a lot of progress.
Yeah, you have made a lot of progress.
I went from colored person to person of color. So, and on top of that, you can add ADHD, which I didn't know I had because it wasn't invented when I was a kid, evidently. But folks just said I was nervous or agitated or hyperactive. That was a wonderful title that came along by the time I was in high school. But what was after my son was diagnosed that I began to learn more about it. And one psychiatrist said to my wife and I that this often runs in families.
So, you know, Clarence, you were actually going to my next question, because I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you, at what developmental stage were you diagnosed with ADHD, and what was your reaction? And do you ever recall being stigmatized after you told about your diagnosis?
I think that, well, at least if I was stigmatized, I didn't know it. Because by then I was already an established professional, which just defies the stereotype. And that makes ADD or ADHD the type of disabilities that are more invisible disabilities. And when you don't have visibility for it, then people don't understand that you have a problem, a challenge that other people may not have. And this becomes relevant in times, as I learned, when you're dealing with children especially, here in DC, for example, I found that it was easier to get assistance under the Americans with Disabilities Act and other services in the city, because it was understood that the city's school system wasn't as developed as far as handling children with special needs as some of the suburban systems were. And we discovered firsthand that the suburban systems were somewhat overrated by their own rating system. And so it made it more of a challenge for people to get proper services in the suburbs than in the city, again, because of stereotypes. But the good thing about it was we were able to get our son into a school that was really well integrated by Washington standards, meaning you had folks from the least developed parts of the city, rubbing elbows with the children of cabinet officers. And it was a real mix in that way.
So let me follow up on that then. So if your disability is invisible, you said you don't have to really sort of disclose it. So were there times when you had to disclose it?
Only when I was interviewed about it. I think because there's well, when you are dealing with a developmental problem that is not visible, then it's not easy to diagnose either. And so it takes specialists to do that. And at the same time, when you've got kids who say, you've got a kid who's quite hyperactive, who disrupts the classroom, who may be more difficult to handle than others, very often they just immediately get assigned to a group that's just isolated from everybody else and don't really get direct services that they need or the attention they need, or well-meaning teachers just don't know that much about how to handle ADD kids. I told you a story about how my son was put in a seat, this is in the 5th grade, put in a seat in the back of the room that was facing away from the teacher. And the special needs counselor said that that's exactly the wrong place to put him. He needs to be up front facing the teacher. And indeed, it was much easier for him to hold his attention, and also easier for the teacher to have an interchange with him with a simple seating change.
All right, well, that's very interesting about how your disability you can sort of navigate the world without anyone even knowing about that, right? I mean, let's turn to Katie, because your disability is also invisible, if you will. Yeah. And so I want to ask you this question. How have you had to navigate the world as a deaf queer person in your professional, academic, and personal world? And also, what are some of the challenges and triumphs you can share with us today about how you have navigated these multiple identities?
Sure. So for me, being a deaf person of color as well as somebody who is queer, I've definitely had some challenges finding jobs sometimes, and also just being able to find my social place and my place in society, really. So how I got about that, I was trying to be my best advocate and being able to tell my friends and my family when I can't hear them, because even though I have cochlear implants, it doesn't mean that I can hear real well. So I still, even if it's just at dinner with my parents, I still can't hear them across the table, even if that's 4 feet away. So I have to ask them to repeat themselves. But for me, it feels like a really big burden, and then I'm asking them to, like, a huge favor, but really it's not that big of a favor, but that's not what it feels like for me. So I've had to apply that to my college career as well, and asking my professors to wear a microphone or to repeat what they said. And so that's one way I've gone about that. In terms of my job, I've had to narrow down my search pool when it comes to jobs, because I can't be a pilot, I can't join the military, I can't do certain jobs that are heavily dependent on hearing ability. And so I have to limit myself to things that I can feasibly do unless I'm willing to fight for my right to have that job. For example, in the military, I've been told that I can't join the military, but then I've also been encouraged to look at non-combat jobs in the military as well. But it's like, do I want to put up with that fight? For example, somebody mentioned in an earlier panel that they were left behind during fire alarms, and that's happened to me too, because even though I can hear, I still don't wake up during the fire alarms because I take my cochlear implants off at night and I can't hear anything. And then we have an LED strobe light right above my bed that'll go off as well. But I sleep like a log, so that didn't wake me up. So I've been left in the building twice during fire alarms as well. So just having to say, hey, you know what, I'm deaf. If I can speak, that's great. If I, can hear sometimes, that's great, but you still need to help accommodate me and make sure that I am included in public safety trainings as well.
If your disability is invisible, how do you hold other individuals accountable to sort of integrate all of your identities? How do they get to respect the fact that you are deaf and respect the fact that you're queer? How do you sort of navigate that when you have this invisible disability?
I guess it's not a very good way for me to do it myself, but it's a good way for me to test other people's knowledge and patience, and I would not recommend doing it this way, but I will sit silently by until my friends turn on the captions, and then if they start talking about the movie at the end of it and I'm not contributing to the conversation, they'll eventually figure out that they forgot to turn the captions on, and therefore I don't know what the movie's about. Or if it's like in a conversation, I want to engage, but if I don't talk, that means I'm not getting it. So I would not recommend that you just stand by and not say anything, but that's kind of the way I'm just like, hey friends, hey family, if you don't look at me when you talk, if you don't turn the captions on, I'm not going to be a part of your world. I'm not going to be a part of your conversation. So do something about it, because I can't do it for the rest of my life, even though that's what the reality is. And I'm just already at 22 years old, my fuse is really short. So I want people to learn now sooner than later.
Thank you very much. So, Stephanie, now you can't walk into a room and hide behind your disability, can you?
Oh no.
So what's that like?
I very much lean into it, Ben. If for anyone who knows me, for people who were around when I was a fellow at RespectAbility, they know I'm very loud and there, and I make my presence known. As you can see, various people who were around during my fellowship are nodding their heads and laughing. Yes, I very much lean into it because, and every day I thank God or whatever higher power there is, maybe even my mother, for giving me the personality that I have, which is very combative and contrary. So whenever everyone wants to go right, I want to go left. So I'm never one to hide. So I have this disability that I can't hide, and I don't want to hide necessarily. So, you know, everything works out because of it.
So let me ask it another way as well. So studies show that many people within the Latino and other communities hide their, invisible disabilities due to negative stigma. So in light of your visible disability, let's look at it this way. What are some of the ways that you've overcome that as a little person?
So for me, well, my mother and I recently had this conversation, and I asked her yesterday, I think, can I use this conversation on this panel? And she said sure, because it's an important we had an important conversation right about this. So it was about, we were talking about how Latino families, Latinx, whatever you want to use, whatever you think is appropriate to use. Sometimes there's a stigma, not only about mental health, but around disabilities, or around even like invisible or visible disabilities. In Latin American countries, there's still this tendency to hide away a child with Down syndrome, with any sort of visible disability, any visible difference. And even when you have an invisible disability, it's never given the attention that is necessary to sort of become better. And we were talking about this because my mother is the complete opposite of this sort of stereotype or tendency of Latino families. My mother very much believed in mental health awareness. She always thought it was important for us to see a psychologist for every important development. She made me see a therapist for most of my childhood because she was worried that I would get bullied and not have any outlet for it. I was not bullied as a child. I was actually very popular, but so
Okay.
Yeah, so
I think we get it. Yeah. You're a parakeet, right?
So that's all I'm gonna say. But yeah, it is a very important conversation to have.
It is important. Thank you. So I'm going to turn to the educational front again and come back to you, Clarence. So we're going to think about Black students, right? We're going to think about there's 1,199,73 Black students K through 12 with disabilities in America today, and the deck is stacked, as you know, against them. Frequently invisible, again, disabilities such as ADHD are not diagnosed with students, and they do not get the supports that they need to achieve. African American students with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by suspensions in schools, with more than 4 boys of color with disabilities and nearly 1 in 5 girls with disabilities receiving out-of-school suspensions. So on the employment front, I should say, 28.7% of African Americans with disabilities are unemployed in the United States compared to 72% of African Americans who are unemployed. So Clarence, while the statistics speak for themselves, okay, regarding unemployment for African Americans with disabilities, your bio shares that your ADHD actually helped you become employed, right? Could you elaborate more about this, and could you project, if you could project that if your disability was visible, would you have a different employment outcome?
Yeah, I want to be very careful in phrasing this so not to be misunderstood. It wasn't that my disability helped me to get employment, but my disability helped to steer me toward employment that would be accommodating for me. In other words, I'm talking about daily journalism, which is notoriously created for and aimed at people with short attention spans. It is, any of you who've ever had an experience in your lives of working for a daily newspaper or a daily broadcast news operation know that one of the joys of it to me is that I can get up in the morning, head to work, it's a clean slate, you don't know what news is going to be breaking that day unless you're awakened by it at 4 o'clock in the morning like I was once or twice. But there's a big story, you got to go out there no matter what it is, become an instant expert at it. Gather up all the information you can and put a story together by deadline time. Once you're past the deadline, you got it turned in, you can forget about it and aim toward tomorrow and the next big story. It's great in those terms of, for my personality. I just found myself gravitating toward it. And it was years later when I wrote a book called Showing My Color. It was something of a professional memoir. And my son, who was then about 10 or 12, said, "By the way, Dad, have you ever read your own book?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "I mean, from like start to finish, the whole thing." He knows how I work. So actually, I hadn't thought about it until he asked, but I realized when I put the book together, I wrote it 1 chapter at a time. And through the whole drafting process and final draft, 1 chapter at a time until I had enough chapters together to have a book. But that's the way it turned out later on now when I started learning more about ADD and ADHD, that's how a lot of students with ADD are advised to approach big assignments, break them up into small pieces. Good advice for everybody, really. And that sort of thing was how I began to learn how to deal with it, and also really turn it to my advantage. Now, if I'm ever asked to go and write a book from start to finish, that will be a new challenge for me. But it's been very helpful for me, though, in terms of I've been amazed how much I can learn in a hurry. I'll never forget the day that Picasso died. I was on the city desk in Chicago, and I was asked to do a piece on what we call in Chicago the Picasso. You've seen this huge sculpture that's down by City Hall. And there's a hell of a story behind it, as it turned out. Luckily enough, it was a Sunday afternoon, but I got a hold of a couple of architects and some other people and found out, Picasso never came to Chicago. He was sent a box full of stuff from Chicago, a Cubs cap, a pizza. I don't know how well that lasted, but anyway, he created it from that. It was a fascinating story, and I amazed myself at how much I learned by the end of the day. People ask, were you an art history major or something? No, but that was the joy of the job. So there are just certain professions you can turn a disability like mine to your advantage.
Okay, thank you. So Katie, I'm going to turn back to you again. So you would probably consider yourself a high achiever, right?
Yes.
I think so. So in light of your academic pursuits, what advice would you give other people who live with multiple identities, right? Or I guess are within the multiple identity status, have a multiple identity status, and who want to be high achievers? What advice could you give them?
My advice would be to just do what you feel like you want to do and not just shut down at the feedback of other people, especially friends and family. And I think the closer they are to yourself, the more influential they are. And I have learned that you don't have to do what your family tells you to do. You don't have to do what your friends expect you to do. So what I did was I held the bar higher than how my parents and friends held it. It was way higher, and I told myself if I reach that, that'll be an accomplishment for myself, and I'll have, outdone the expectations that my family and friends expected of me. And that allowed me to feel a sense of accomplishment, whereas if I had set the bar lower than how my parents or friends envisioned me accomplishing things, then I would have felt less successful. So just setting the bar at whatever level you want it to be and whatever level you know you'll feel comfortable, and be able to be proud and saying, I did that and I'm proud of myself for doing it regardless of what your family and friends say, and just doing it no matter what the challenges are that come up. It might take years to get done, or it might just take a short time and you'll get it done eventually.
Okay, I think I use the term showing up unapologetically.
Yeah, that too.
All right, sounds good. All right, Stephanie?
Yes.
I think I want to turn to you and ask you this question about employers. I think we spoke before, and we talked about how important it is, right, when you go into a job interview and how you're perceived, right? Mm-hmm. So how important is it that employers work from a framework of intersectionality in order to enable Latinos, such as yourself, and a little person with disabilities to succeed?
Oh, it's so important, but you can never guarantee that an employer is going to have that mindset or is going to be able to think about creative accommodations, I should say. So you have to know your rights. So when I first moved to Washington, D.C., this was last year actually, I applied for a desk job part-time, and it was the first job I applied to in DC. It was also the first interview I got. So I was very excited. It was geared for students looking for a part-time, something that wouldn't be too labor intensive or anything that's like too intense mentally. It was literally data entry. So I applied and I went for my interview. The first half of the interview went really well. We got along really well, the interviewer and I, and she said, okay, well, I'm gonna go to my boss. So, and she's gonna finish the other half of the interview. And so, this older lady comes into the room, and she looks at me, and her eyes get really wide, and she whispers, oh, and she said, oh no. Well, you can hear the oh no coming out, but she just said oh. And so she sits down very awkwardly, and the interview goes very stiltedly, the complete opposite of what the first half of the interview was going on. And then she said, well, frankly, I don't think you're capable of doing any of the labor-intensive work. And I looked at her and I said, that wasn't anything on the application about labor-intensive work. And she said, well, you have to lift 25 pounds occasionally. And I was like, that's an accommodation. Like, I wish I had said, well, that's an accommodation. At the time, I didn't know what an accommodation is, or what would be a fair accommodation. Because we don't always know until we get that information, or that information is assuming. We can't advocate properly for ourselves until we have that knowledge, that is to say. And so, at the time I didn't know, and I said, oh, okay, well, I can work around it. And she was like, oh, really? I was like, oh, yes, I can work around it. And then she looked at my application and said, well, I don't think you're smart enough to do this. And I looked at her, and this is where my snark came out. And I said, I have a 4.7 GPA. I think I'll be fine with data entry. But, then I walked out. I did not proceed to get the job, but, I didn't want that job anymore. So.
Thank you.
You need to know so
Right.
you can advocate for yourself.
That's very important. I know that, as I mentioned, when I became an amputee, I was always advocating for myself because I sort of live in this sort of schizophrenic world. You know, I walk out into the world and you see a leg because you see a prosthetic, but at the same time you see this cane and you see this limp and it's like, I don't know what's going on here. And so when people try to put you in a box, they automatically assume, right? And it's interesting that I will always be relegated to not getting a job, right, as opposed to being hired for the job. I don't want to really get too much into my story, but because I do want to ask you to think about this. I want the audience to think about this and open this up for questions. So we have about 15 minutes, and we wanted to have this opportunity to ask you questions or have you ask questions of the panel. And this is the question I would like for you to think about, if you could. What are some of the ways, I guess, we can go about creating awareness and application of intersectionality in our communities, in our circles, both personally and professionally? So if the panel wants to address that first, I'd like to open it up to the audience.
People have questions?
Yes.
I didn't have a question, but I thought maybe I might try to answer.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Your question. Oh.
Thank you.
I have two questions, actually. I have one for Katie also. I don't have to turn on the mic. I don't need a mic.
No, you do.
Yeah, you do.
I need the battery on this one just died. Need a mic? Probably not that important, but if you're saying how to have intersectionality, how to create more of it, in the world I'm in, where we educate people with intellectual disabilities how to live and work independently, I feel every time somebody with a disability goes out into the world, they're ambassadors and they're changing the world. And I think somebody else around here said the same thing at some point, that that's your best teacher, not preaching to someone, but experiencing people with disabilities and seeing the positivity of it. And it's an experiential thing. I don't think it's an intellectual thing. And I don't think you can train them in and out of it. I think people, for instance, just being here and being exposed to this conference will walk away with a different view of people with disabilities because we experienced them personally. So I think that's the best thing. If I could promote anything, it would be continually, and I can personally do it because I'm service oriented, continually training people to go out in the world. It really is magical. I've gotten comments back from employers saying, oh my God, and I'm not talking about these brilliant autistic kids who can do all these things that other people, I'm talking about people who are taking maybe entry-level jobs and may need some accommodations. And I hear stories like, he's the best employee. I mean, he comes to the job, it's raining and it's snowing, and he's really the soul of our company, and I don't know what we would do without them. I mean, things like that. So that's opening people's eyes. And the other thing, Katie, I wanted to ask you, because in my dotage, I'm becoming hard of hearing, and I don't know how to read sign language. Did you say that when you are with your friends and they don't have on closed caption, that you keep quiet? Did you say that?
Yeah.
Why are you quiet?
I usually do that because I am tired of advocating for myself, and I've had a long stretch of it in high school, and then when I get to college, I figured, well, like, I don't know, by now I'm in a college institution, and turns out they don't, and it's actually a little bit worse than high school. So I guess I just wait for them unless I'm comfortable with talking to them. But a lot of it is that I'm uncomfortable with advocating for myself, and I'm unsure of the judgments that I'm going to receive from other people, so I would rather just stand back in the corner than say anything. Then again, it's situation dependent on who I'm with.
Katie, if you don't advocate for yourself, no one's going to do it for you. And I, who am in mostly a non-disability social world, I'm constantly telling people turn on closed caption. And they don't like to turn on closed caption because it's distracting to them. But I do it anyway. I guess it's a matter of personality, but if I could say anything to you, you've got to advocate for yourself. There's no person that's sitting around who's going to take up for you. Anyway, that's that.
Thank you.
My question was for Maris. I'm also a person with ADHD, and that was something that I realized later on. I was diagnosed probably around 13.
Right.
And it was very apparent in my elementary school and middle school. I was very hyperactive all over the place, couldn't really sit down, talked a lot, and I got in trouble for it.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, yeah.
By the way, in the 9th grade, as one teacher who was the advisor to the student newspaper, I asked him if I might be a possibility that I could write for the paper. He thought I was playing one of my tricks on him again. and he made it very clear that I had no future in journalism. I always wondered what happened to him. Well, please continue.
And in order to sort of just combat that, deal with that sort of disability, I, was medicated. And I wanted to know, as a parent who has a child with ADHD, how you feel about that, how medicating a child to change their thought process to fit in with the general society.
Well, my son's more scared of drugs than I am, probably a generational difference there. But the fact is that I think, different people have found positive effects, but do them under a psychiatrist's care, a doctor who knows what they're doing. They're not for everybody, and not every drug is for everybody either. But Concerta works well for me. I started out on Ritalin, and but at the same time, I don't want to have a habit of it, doing it all the time. But when you know that you're going to be going into a high pressure situation and all, or going to be having a big project, these can be helpful. But as my son said, they don't make you smarter, Dad. I've always remembered that. They don't make you smarter. They just make it a little bit easier for you to get over some of those humps when distractibility, one of my big problems.
Good question.
Sure.
Thank you. Yes, so a couple questions. So I'm going to take a mic here.
We could probably have a whole panel about the use of chemicals or not to deal with ADHD, ADD, anxiety, depression, a whole host of chemically related issues that are perhaps silent disabilities. And I think that question probably ought to be taken up, because I think a lot of people don't seek treatment because they're afraid of that, and that does, I would say, inhibit their opportunities. And once people are in a place to be able to consider all their options, then they can make decisions about that. And it's I have actually 2 sons who both have ADHD and other issues, and deciding whether or not and when, and for them as young people to decide whether or not and when has been an ongoing conversation. And I think there's a stigma around medication that gets, in the same way that so many other disabilities that are more obvious, the stigma of medication, I think, is something that needs to be tackled in the larger discussion. That's not what I was going to talk about. What I was going to talk about was about intersectionality and inclusion. I'm here representing an organization in Jerusalem which has called Shutaf, which does what I call an inverted inclusion program, in that there are probably more young people with disabilities than people with normally developing, however you want to call that. And while it's incredibly important for those young people to have a place that's safe for them to go, what we've learned is that for the quote-unquote normally developing young people, it's even more important because they get to understand the world in a kind of spectrum of abilities that's quite dynamic, and that they learn quite a bit more about dealing with themselves and other people than the children who have quote-unquote issues. Okay, thank you.
Hi. Katie, I just wanted to ask if you've ever had a moment where you decided not to advocate for yourself, particularly with a close friend, and then later they kind of had an aha moment with something that you would think would be common sense, like putting on subtitles, if they had ever realized it after the fact.
Sure. I did have a moment like that with one of my good friends in freshman year where I have a FM system microphone that I have the professors wear and that I have on the table if we're in a small group discussion or anything of the sort. And this pen, it looks like a microphone, it's not this, but it's a microphone, but it looks like a pen. But I had a different model before, and the professor set it down on a table for a short discussion, and then my friend, as we were wrapping things up, she grabbed my FM microphone and handed it over to my professor. And at the time, I was a young mind and didn't think I could advocate for myself face to face with my friend. So I sent her a long email that could be a novel and said, I really didn't appreciate that you handed the pen over to the professor without asking my permission, because that's like, that might be like holding the door open for someone who uses a wheelchair. Some people don't like that. I didn't like that. My friend wouldn't allow me to be independent and required, assumed that I needed to be helped. So I emailed her and said, I didn't like that. And her response was, oh, I didn't think about that. I'm so sorry about that I did that. And it's like, just because I have these devices, just because I have these accommodations, it doesn't mean I need you to do everything for me, because I'm perfectly self-sufficient for the most part, too. Does that answer it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So I want to have some final, I'm sorry, was there another question?
There's one over here, and then I will catch more in a sec.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Farah. I'm with the Easter Seals Disability Staffing Network, and I'll try to be brief. Just kind of responding to what was being said about intersectionality. I thought about kind of my own experience and also interviewing for this disability staffing network, me being somebody who has both physical and mental disabilities, and also from a West African background. When I went to interview for my job, the Vice President of Employment Services was somebody who was very jovial, he was very cordial, he was cracking a lot of jokes. But the way that my culture is, like when we go for an interview, when you meet an elder, when you meet a job, you're very quiet, you're very respectable, and that's just the way that you show respect to your elders. You don't kind of joke back and forth. And so about halfway through my interview, I stopped and I thought to myself, if I don't joke back and kind of take the posture that he's taking, I'm not gonna get this job. And I did, and I got the job, and I've been loving it. But I've been thinking with some of our candidates who are on different aspects of the neurodivergent spectrum, if they can't pick up on those social cues, even though they have the skills to be able to do the job, they may not necessarily make that same type of impression in the interview, even though they're perfectly capable of being able to do it, just like I am. So I share this with our business developer, I share this with the people who go out into the field and who are interfacing with potential employers for our candidates who have disabilities. And so I had wanted to ask our panel if you could let an employer or a potential employer know one thing about your disability or about your identities, what would that be?
Good question. Who wants to take that one?
I can take it, actually. It's a very loaded question, but I think it's an important one. I think not only people who are applying to jobs need to be mindful of sort of reflecting the atmosphere that a potential employer or a hiring manager is giving off, but hiring managers need to do the same, particularly when you're dealing with someone who is of a different culture or of a different disability that does require that. I think there needs to be more not sensitivity training, but sort of awareness on that, because it's on hiring managers too. It's not just on the people who are interviewing for a position. There needs to be reciprocity in that respect. Does that answer it well?
I think it does. So I'm gonna end with this, sort of the same thing, supporting exactly what you just said. Through an awareness of intersectionality, we can better acknowledge and ground the differences among us. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for the panel, for giving us a thoughtful discussion on this topic, and go out into the world and, blend, show up and just blend. Make it that you don't have to compartmentalize or separate who you are. And that's for anyone. And hold people accountable. So on that note, thank you.
That was really, really, really tremendous. Thank you so much to our panel. It was really fantastic.